Hey guys, welcome to another Honest Youth Pastor live podcast, Monday podcast. Uh, so tonight, Matt has joined. I just want to tell you guys the dedication level of Matt here. He is literally on vacation and has decided to pop in anyway to talk about what we're looking at tonight. So thank you, Matt, all the way from. I mean, look at that beautiful view behind you. That's amazing. Palm
Yeah,
tree.
it's Orlando, Florida. I'm here to pay homage to the giant rat.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So, well, that's not one of our topics tonight. I guess we could talk about the whole bill that got signed in today, but we won't do that. We don't have we have other things we're going to be talking about. So in case you guys are just joining this or you're watching the replay each Monday night at 8 o'clock, I'll be going live. Matt will sometimes, well, so far 2 for 2 has been with me, and then we'll try to have other people on as well. But the idea of this is to cover topics that are really sort of within Christian culture right now. And then when we get back on Instagram after Easter, the idea will be to discuss the memes that are on the account and sort of the discussions that start in the comment sections there. This whole thing, this whole live is basically a way to interact more on the topics that we're going to end up talking about on the Instagram page. But until we get back on there, this is sort of like a dress rehearsal of sorts to talk about Christian culture and what's going on in Christian culture right now. And we have 3 topics tonight that we're going to talk about. The first one I'm actually pretty interested in because I know, Matt, you have a lot of theological knowledge, history, all of that sort of stuff in the Old Testament as well. So we're going to be talking about sort of Old Testament belief, the Israelites and that stuff. I'll put that slide up in a minute. Then we'll move on to some of you guys might have heard about or seen the Jackie Hill Perry picture she shared of the Supreme Court hearings, and then we will get on a little bit to the John MacArthur stuff. You guys wanted to talk about that last time. I don't know how much we'll actually spend on that, but we have until 9 o'clock. We have an hour, so we'll see where we get on that. So let me put this first slide up that we're going to talk about, because this was again, if you're not on Twitter and you're not in like this subsection of Twitter, sometimes you don't see these things. But the first one I want to talk about tonight is there was somebody, this shot was actually going around. This screenshot was going around. And the first part of it says, do Christians know that the early Israelites were a polytheist? And then it kind of goes down the train there where somebody else says, seeing their faces. I'm sorry, I can't even see. This is so small. Their faces when you tell them that there was a whole pantheon is priceless. And then we have somebody else at the end talking about Genesis 1 and the Trinity. Now, here's sort of where I want to go with this conversation, Matt. I grew up in a church that talked a whole bunch about the Old Testament. It was pretty well clear to us, like it was known to us that the Israelites, like that was kind of the whole deal. That was the whole problem, that they did worship all of these other gods as well, alongside of God the Father, the creator of everything. And it was interesting to see sort of within this Twitter thread that there was this assumption. Now, just so I'm clear, these people that were sort of mentioned in that Twitter thread there, the one that started it, they're all ex-evangelicals. They would claim that, fit themselves into that category, all of that. And they sort of seem to hold this idea that they were never taught that in church. They were never taught that, yeah, Israel, didn't hold to one God the entire time. And that came later, and this is some big news to Christians. But I was like, I don't know. I was taught that from early on. So what's your experience with that when you're talking to other Christians, Matt? Have you like ran into that a lot where this is sort of not common knowledge?
Yes, it is. And if you don't mind, will you give me just a few moments, because my headphones are almost here, and I will be able to hear you, and you guys will be able to hear me. So you just keep on going, Michael. Okay. You're doing wonderful, and I will jump in as soon as I'm able to conveniently.
Okay, cool. All right. So we got some technical issues going on here. So here's the reason I wanted to really talk about this, though, because apparently what it sort of seems like is that from this thread is that this is sort of a shock to some Christians. Now, maybe it is. If it is a shock to you, if maybe you can comment and tell me what your experience was growing up in church. Did you hear about this? Like, was this something that was taught, for example, that, hey, yeah, Israel did worship a whole bunch of other gods alongside of God the Father, and that was sort of the whole deal. That was sort of the whole, hey guys, raising up prophets, for example, to say, hey, you're worshiping other gods. God is a jealous God, and you're going to be punished for this and swept away and taken over by other nations and that sort of thing. That seems to be by the nature of the tweet and sort of the thread underneath that. Like if you look at all the comments, and some people weren't taught that. So that leaves us a couple of interesting questions to ask. One, was anybody paying attention in Sunday school or in church? Or two, are there pastors out there that maybe don't communicate that incredibly well? And because that's not communicated maybe really clearly, then um we're missing out on this really rich history of the Old Testament, where we do, for example, like some of the things in this thread we're mentioning, that like ancient artifacts, for example, they found carvings of them worshiping other gods alongside Yahweh. And this was like some sort of like, oh no, this big proof, that these things were happening, and this is some big shock and whatnot. But I don't know. We might have lost Matt here for a second. But let's bring one comment on here real quick. God had to keep admonishing them for wandering away from him. Yeah. So that's one of the things that I found odd about this Twitter thing. And I just want to bring it up. So this was sort of a one-off when I saw it. It got shared a bunch. And the more it got shared, the more interesting it was, that I was like, okay, so apparently people haven't heard about this. But if you read the Old Testament, what you will see is, yeah, God had to keep admonishing them because they did wander away from him so much. So that was, anyway, that was one of the more interesting things there. Now, I don't know if we've got Matt actually. Let me see. Okay, so I don't know. We might have lost. Oh, there he is.
I am back now. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear and see you now.
Okay, awesome. Well, I can hear you much better now that I have my trusty headphones on.
Excellent.
Got everything hooked up, and I did hear everything that you just said, and it sounds like you are addressing one of the comments, or is that already? Okay, yeah.
No, No, they had just said that they had heard about it, yes, about how God had kept admonishing. But apparently, the whole reason to bring up this Twitter thread that I brought on was because apparently there is a subgroup of people, or a group of people, at least within this ex-evangelicals that were in this thread, that this was sort of this shocking thing that they didn't think most evangelicals knew about. And I was under the impression that all evangelicals knew about this. But anyway, I just wanted, what I was going to pick your brain about, because I know, I mean, you know quite a bit about the text and all of that as well. But have you ran into people that don't know that? Like, have you ran into people that aren't aware?
So I think the issue is that, and this is sort of the thing that these ex-evangelicals are starting to gear towards, is that people, even though they know the history of the Jewish tradition, theologically, they hold to the fact, which I also hold to, that God, Yahweh, always had a remnant. And that is more of a theological assumption or decision that we bring with us out of the text. So I think what these ex-evangelicals are doing are saying, yes, we also know that Israel had a quote-unquote problem with polytheism throughout their history, but they take it a step further in saying that Israel, in its early conceptive stage, all the way up until around the last 5 centuries BC, were largely polytheistic in a good way. That essentially they assume that there were no monotheists. And a lot of this, just to give a little bit of a history lesson, a lot of this began in the early days of the Enlightenment period in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, when reason, which is a good thing, but it sort of became the ruler of faith rather than a cohort of faith. And in that, there is a long and complicated history in European biblical studies and in the study of theology, in which people began to doubt originally the veracity of the miracles in both the Old and the New Testament. They begin to doubt the validity of history as being literal as given to us in the Old Testament. And so there is this move to use the Rudolf Bultmann's term, demythologization of the Old Testament. And that was the assumption that the Old Testament, as we now have it, is more about Jewish mythology and them mythologizing their history and providing all of these miraculous events and sort of creating a backstory for themselves that they see as not really lining up with history as it is. And so they see that, and the progression and the process of this mythologizing the Jewish history from the point of around 500 BC up until the 1st century AD in Jesus's time. Part of this is the quote unquote mythology of consistent monotheism. And so they see it as the last few centuries BC and the 1st century AD Jews reading their monotheistic tendencies in that era backwards into the past. So they say that consistent Hebrew monotheism is anachronistic. That they say that everybody then was polytheistic, and then eventually they sort of adopted this one God out of the pantheon of the ancient Near Eastern Mediterranean world, which came to be known as Yahweh. And a part of this, let's take Genesis, for example. So in scholarly circles, you may have heard of the JEPD approach in terms of studying Genesis in its development in the form that we have it in now. And they see a process of redaction, which just means editorial work on Genesis and the Torah as we have it, and they see it represented in 4 major streams. So we call it in English JEPD because there is I guess we would say the Jahwist, or actually Yahwist tradition, the Elohist tradition, the priestly, and the Deuteronomistic. So essentially, the Yahwist and the Elohist are the 2 oldest, presumably the Elohist, coming from like El and Elohim, being the very sort of like the roots of what we have in Genesis. And so they see an easy way to look at this is they say that anytime that you see a narrative or a passage that refers to God as El or Elohim, is usually one of the older ones. And then the next step would be the Yahwistic tendency. So the Yahwistic tendency would come later in the Jewish history from their perspective. And that is when they say that like this idea of monotheism began to develop. And so you begin to see the concentration on Yahweh as the center focus. And then from there, when in their eyes they see the priestly formalistic tradition surrounding the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, they see priestly editorial hands in reading in sacrificial language and cleanliness, and just sort of like you might call the tendencies of like moral conduct, and also in the Jewish cult. And when I say cult, I don't mean like cults in wrong belief, but just the word cult in and of itself just means a system of worship, essentially. And then lastly, you have the Deuteronomistic, which even in its terms, deuteronomos in Greek means the second law. And so you see this as like the Deuteronomy being added into the Torah, and this being like the last form that the Jews anachronistically, mythologically rewrote and reread their history after the exile, and you get what's called Second Temple Judaism, into which Jesus comes onto the scene. And so in the academy, from the time of the Enlightenment, beginning in the 16th, 17th centuries, continuing very heavily in the 18th through the 20th, 21st century now. And in the academy, you have people who are teaching these things as gospel truth more so than theories, because ultimately we're dealing with very ancient history. Like even if they were right, they don't have any valid sort of proof. And there are so many theories depending on who you read in the academy, with all of these possibilities, and nobody really agrees with anybody else on a lot of the details. But you have these things being presented to young seminarians, people who are going through deconstruction, evangelicals, and they see this as a tool, or even as a weapon. And even evangelicals and other Christians are the same way. Just it's human tendency that you want to have a bias confirmation, or at least you want to find some kind of loophole that you can use against the people that you see as the enemy, or stick it to the man, or stick it to the system, or whatever it may be. And so you have people latch onto this, and they just completely run with it. Now, the one thing that I can say that gives credence to this, sort of mixing in with the tendency towards idolatry, as we would call it, in Jewish history, you have to understand even the Hebrew language comes from very ancient Semitic languages. Like if you are an Old Testament scholar who is, especially in grad school, not only are you going to have to take Hebrew, mostly biblical Hebrew, but you also have to take Ugaritic and sometimes Akkadian, even other times Egyptian hieroglyphs. I know that at one of the seminaries, my first seminary that I graduated from, the professor who taught Ugaritic, Akkadian, and hieroglyphs was actually taking a sabbatical during the 2 years I was there. So I wasn't able to take any of his courses or learn any of that, but I would have been required to, because I concentrate on the New Testament. But from what I know about these ancient Semitic languages specifically, is a lot of their words for God comes from what we see as El. In Hebrew, it is Aleph, Lamed, and I would write it out if I could. But even Aleph, which is the first letter in the Hebrew Aleph Bet, comes from these Akkadian, Ugaritic, almost hieroglyphic languages, and even it in and of itself is in the shape of a bull. If you look at an Aleph, you turn a little bit sideways, you can kind of see the horns and so on and so forth. And so the Hebrew language is riding on the back of these truly polytheistic pagan heathen nations, out of which the Hebrews were called. So, Abraham, whether he spoke Hebrew or whatever he may have spoke or read, was called out of the Chaldees, was called, out of this huge metropolis of Ur in the ancient world. And he's in the midst of only polytheism. And so this God, who eventually reveals himself as the one true God, calls him out of this. And so, Abraham didn't just drop the language and the culture that he grew up in, but he had to approximate that, and that was passed down through tradition. And so, just like in modern Arabic, you have Allah, that just means God in general. And in the same way, in the Hebrew, you have the word El, which just means God. And all of these other ancient Semitic languages would have also shared that similarity in having the El as just being God. That is why, especially with the narrative of Moses, it's so important that you have this Hebrew who is raised in Egypt in another polytheistic pantheon environment. You have the Hebrew people who have been there for several hundred years, who are probably, wondering where the God of their fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is. And, like maybe even dabbling into the polytheism of Egypt itself. And then you have Moses going into exile into Midian, where he meets Jethro, and he's the high priest of Midian. I mean, honestly, we don't even know what god or gods, Jethro represented. And so Moses comes out of this, which, I mean, a lot of these people are going to seriously doubt the veracity that there was ever a historical figure called Moses. Anyways, but as far as the narrative itself, you have Moses, and he's out here in the wilderness by himself, and all of a sudden, this God speaks to him and gives him this assignment. Well, what is Moses' question? He's like, who do I tell them has sent me? Because in Moses' mind, there's like, maybe this pantheon of gods: Egyptian, ancient near Mediterranean, Mesopotamian, and the God that we know says Hava Yehovah, which means that I am that I am. I am who I am, or it could even be I will be who I will be. The Greek translates it as I am the one who is being. And so in this name establishes this monotheistic tendency that you see the remnant throughout Israel clinging to. So, short story made long. So what's going on is that you have the academy that is using their view of history, and you have the Orthodox clinging to the narrative of Scripture, and we're sort of saying the same thing but coming to very different conclusions. And so these evangelicals are trying to, they're wanting to use this conclusion to sort of get an upper hand and pull the tablecloth off the table. But instead of leaving all of the silverware and the glassware on the table, they want to pull it all off, and sort of like look at the table that's underneath. But I think it's really the tendency to take all of this academic work as gospel truth, and that's sort of where they're coming from. And yes, of course, there was a pantheon in ancient Israel. I mean, there were plenty of times that the majority of Jewish people were worshiping false gods. You look in the narrative of Aaron and the people being down at the foot of the mountain, and they're like, is Moses even coming back down? Was this just like some kind of like big trick? Like Moses just like ran off and left us here, like, I gotcha, And so so they say, we want to see this God. So Aaron's like, okay, and he makes a bull, which, as I said, connects to the whole idea of El as being like this God, this bull God almost, And you have that. Even when you get into the times of the established Israelite monarchy, when you have the split between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, Jeroboam, what's the first thing that he does? He sets up these idols to these potentially other gods in Samaria, and creates several hundred years of tension in which the northern Israel continually falls into idolatry. You have Solomon, who starts out worshiping the one true God. By the end of his life, he's worshiping this other pantheon. But there's always a remnant of those monotheists that persists. And I know that's a lot, and it still doesn't cover all the bases, but that's what I've got.
I'm just sitting here going, I need to figure out a way to get you to sit down and just unpack all this in like an 8-part video series that we can give everyone. Because I mean, here's the thing, and I think what's important out of everything you just said there that's incredibly helpful is that, like, I think everybody's probably heard pieces of, like, that story that we've all heard about the burning bush. We've all heard about, the Moses on the mountain and Aaron making the calf. I mean, we've all heard that. But again, when it comes down to, like, I mean, the things that I'm obsessed with all the time and talk to people about, like, when you have that context, when you understand the background and the culture, that just makes it all that more helpful for people to understand what's going on, so that when you hear somebody say, some of the things that, I mean, for example, that was in this whole Twitter thread that we're talking about. When you see something like this, but yet you have the background and the history and the context of what you just, I mean, what you just unpacked there for the last little bit, like that gives you a better understanding of how to interact with these words, other than just being like, oh, I don't know what they're talking about, or maybe even making assumptions that you do know what they're talking about whenever maybe you don't. Because I mean, for example, I know at least Joe in the middle has like a similar background as you as far as study wise and things like that. So when you're coming, or trying to, I don't know if come up against is the right word, but whenever you're trying to sort of have that conversation, most Christians haven't had some sort of history class, like maybe even what you just said is totally new to some people. And because they haven't had that, they're like, oh, well, that changes everything. Like that makes it so much more clear. That clears up a ton of things. And I think that's one of the things that, we need a lot more of what you said there in more of a church history class in our churches in some form or fashion, so that the average layperson can be like, oh, okay, I at least have the surface level knowledge of kind of the entry level here, instead of just coming at it blind and not, maybe there are some people that have that assumption that whatever, who that the verse that you referenced of who shall I say sent me. I think some people, even though we do know that Israel fell into idolatry time and time again, our assumption right away is that he's going, oh, well, he's going to say God, Yahweh, God. But within the context that you just mentioned there, it's incredibly helpful for some people to be like, oh, that's what I mean. That changes the whole question when you understand the context and the culture and the idea behind it. And that helps us better understand everything that unfolds after that. Because even I think one of the things that kind of clicked in my head again, like just sort of a refresh, was like, oh yeah, probably a lot of people did think that the priest of Midian, he was like, oh well, of course it's a priest, so that must mean that he worshiped this god, like the god that we know about. And again, that's not necessarily a given in that response. So I think it's one of the things that it's really good for us to have this knowledge in entering into it in such a way as what you said, though, understanding that this is one idea, this is not gospel by any means, but understanding that this is a thought process that people have, and we need to at least understand that it's out there and how to interact with it. So thank you for that.
Hey, yeah, you're welcome.
Sure.
And did you want me to address the last thing about the us in Genesis 1?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay,
and then we can use the last half hour to kind of unpack the last two things.
Yeah. So I will say this: I did do several videos in the Genesis series that we did in the Real Theology on this. I'm just going to give a very quick reference. So essentially, in a nutshell, theologically, I agree that God was speaking in a Trinitarian essence. But we have to understand that the Trinity is still a human attempt at understanding the progressive revelation of who God is and who God is in God's being. And we know that God has revealed himself as a triune being, as Father, Son, and Spirit, as Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. Several other types of terminology that you can use there. But we also have to understand that when Moses, who, whether he himself wrote Genesis or not, whether he was the originator of an oral tradition, regardless, whoever wrote these passages, they were not writing in a Trinitarian framework. Like they weren't sitting there saying, oh, since God is Trinity, we'll go ahead and say, let us make. So I think when we're working it from a theological perspective, that's totally fine. But it's because I do believe that is the essence of what is being said there. However, from a biblical standpoint and trying to understand the scriptures as inspired by the Spirit, but still set in their own historical contexts, that when this is written, most likely there are two things going on. The first possibility is what some think that God is referencing the idea of the divine council because there are several other places in Scripture where these cryptic references to a divine council are referenced most of the time. At least in Orthodox Jewish thought, this is Yahweh or Adonai. Because they wouldn't say Yahweh. We don't even really know if that's how Yahweh is pronounced. It's just Yud Vav Hey Vav, and they didn't clear that off. But anyways, I lost my train of thought. I started thinking in Hebrew there for a second, and so now I've got to get back on track. But they would have thought of God, Adonai, and like the angelic beings, or I don't know, the other spiritual powers of the heavens that were subservient. Whether or not this, at some point in time was misunderstood as polytheism or what. So it's either God referencing a divine council of sorts. My personal approach to this is that God is using what's called the majestic plural, because even the word Elohim is plural in its use, but the majestic plural is used to insinuate majesty, even when you're referencing one person. Even the word Adonai is still plural as well. But it is a majestic plural in which you are referencing someone who deserves respect, and so therefore you give emphasis by number. And that is a very ancient Semitic Jewish understanding of emphasis. That emphasis is given by repetition or by multiplicity of numbers. So I think that those are two of the major ways that is good to approach that from a very literary form view. Is that one of those two options? Like I said, I prefer the majestic plural. I could be wrong. There could be a totally different option. All of us could be wrong. We don't understand everything in Scripture, but we do believe that it is true for a variety of reasons, and not just because Grandpappy or the pastor told us. But there are reasons. So even though I don't fully understand it, I still believe it.
Gotcha. The fact that to go back to something you said earlier, the fact that you can think in Hebrew and then you have to come back is I wish I could just think in any other language. So there you go. So all right. So
right now I'm also thinking in German as well. So I'm having to transition, and
I don't even have the brain capacity to think in English most days. So I'm glad there are people like you around. All right. So we're gonna move on to something much lighter, not as heavy as far as history and theological. It's going to be more of a cultural thing. So the other day, again, on this whole Twitter thing, Twitter lost their mind because Jackie Hill Perry, which if you guys don't know, she's basically known for her book, Gay Girl, Good God, her converting to Christianity, coming out of the LGBTQ lifestyle, and the book itself. We have a review of the book on in a playlist. It's great. But anyway, the other day she tweeted out this picture of and I'm gonna get her name wrong, so I'm not even gonna try to say it, but it's the Supreme Court nominee, and it just said The Mood, and it's this the Supreme Court nominee's daughter looking at her, and in a proud manner. And Christian Twitter lost their ever-loving mind over this because of what the nominee stands for. She wasn't able to define what a woman was. She is very open to the idea of abortion. She couldn't give a definition, apparently, of when a baby is like a baby. And so there's obviously quite a few Christians that are not at all in favor of this nominee. So when Jackie Hill Perry tweeted this out, there was a lot of retweets. There was a lot of quote tweets. There was a lot of people that were kind of up in arms about it. Now, just so we have context, I do want you, everybody that's kind of listening, just so Jackie, and I'll get to the point of why we're looking at this here in a minute, but she did post sort of a follow-up because of all the heat she got for this. And the follow-up she posted was, I really don't owe anyone but God and my spouse an explanation, but I'll offer one anyway. This picture is beautiful. A daughter proud of her mother, accomplished. It made me think of my girls and the smile I hope to give them one day. Take that and do with what you will please. So her whole thing was that she was like, I'm not endorsing this candidate or what the candidate stands for. I'm just saying, hey, this picture here, this is what I hope my daughters look at me one day and have that same sort of feeling. So the whole point that I'm bringing into our conversation tonight on the podcast is because of how it was reacted to, as well as the sort of the influence some people have within Christianity and sort of the reaction that people get whenever they post things. So, for example, if most of the people I know would have posted that, clearly they don't have the reach or the influence of Jackie O. Perry. Probably wouldn't have got much, if any, of reaction to that at all. But because it was Jackie, there was a lot of people that were very up in arms about that. So the two things I kind of want to pick your brain about, because I mean, I know having a meme page yourself, joining this whole thing, you kind of seen sort of the the reaction to it as well, just to sort of some of the things we post. So the main question from this whole thing that came to the top of my mind is, like, do you think that the internet, in how we as believers interact with it, for the most part, is not exactly the most beneficial for our spiritual development, because of how easy it is to so quickly react and assume people's sort of intent in what we post or what we say. I mean, I know you've seen it, I've seen it whenever I post stuff. Obviously, Jackie's tweet is an example of this as well, is where you're assuming intent behind that before. And I think it sort of goes against the whole slow to speak, quick to listen sort of mentality that believers should have. So that whole question there, do you think that social media in general, not the greatest thing, or I guess maybe Christians as believers, we don't necessarily use it as a tool as we should sometimes?
Absolutely. I will be completely honest with you. If I had not got involved in the Christian meme community when I did, and this was early in 2019, and I'm very, very thankful for it because it essentially helped carry me through 2020, a lot of 2021. But if I wasn't already involved in the meme community and such, I would have no social media. I used to also use Facebook. I don't use Facebook anymore. I don't have a Twitter, and I don't even use I don't use my personal Instagram account. It's just like it's totally dead, and that's just my own personal conviction. I'm not saying that everybody should leave their social media. Yeah. Now, my pastor, on the other hand, don't ask him what he thinks about social media. Because he just says delete it. He does not believe in the use of social media. But like he's writing his PhD, and God has like all this research and so on and so forth on it. So he has good reasons for saying it. But I know that this is just simply where a lot of Christian community happens. This is the day and age that we live in, and so I'm involved in it. So here I am. But as with anything, most things in life, aside from just blatant sin, can be either good or bad. In the words of Paul, all things are permissible for me. All things are allowable for me. But then Paul goes on to finish by saying that not all things are beneficial. Not all things will edify. And so everything or anything can essentially be either a tool or it can be a weapon. Now, our human tendency is to make weapons and then to turn our tools into weapons.
That's a good point.
That's what we love to do. We are so quick, and I'm even talking about myself. I mean, look, I can't put down other people without also implicating myself. Like last night, we had a little bit of something happen at our church. I became hypercritical, and then our family pastor literally had to call me last night and kind of calm me down because the level of hypercritical tendency that I was having towards this particular situation. Thankfully, our lead pastor is handling it, and so it's all good, and so I'm cooling off. But I have that problem too. I think that everybody does, and so. I don't want to be guilty of what the other hypercritical people are being guilty of and just pointing fingers, wanting to cancel and say, forget about it, you're horrible, you're horrid. you know, we don't want to have anything to do with you. Like this is a group effort. Like we are all working through this together. My hero theologically and in several other ways is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That's who my dog is named after. Yeah, and so like I use Dietrich Bonhoeffer quotes all the time. And one of the things that he wrote, he said that we will never have perfect community, but what we do have is Christian community. And there is a distinction there, because in the Christian community, it is all of us working together through our faults, through our downfalls, our mistakes, our successes. You know, in the Christian world, sorrows should be halved, you know, halved, I guess you could say, to kind of agree with that, and joys should be doubled in Christian community. But instead, what we normally do is we discount everybody else's joy, because deep down we're actually bitter and jealous that that's not me who has that kind of following. That's not me who's getting that kind of recognition. That's not me who's getting that success. So we tend to undercut other people's successes and other people's joys, and then we double up on the sorrows. Like, you know, like when somebody falls, typically we are the priest and the Levite on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and we just walk right past the Samaritans. I mean, we look at the people in the ditch, we're like, I mean, you got yourself there. You deserve this, and I'm not going to lift a finger to help, because you're getting exactly what you deserve. Instead of being the Samaritans who are, you know, voices of correction, but also of healing and of grace and understanding and truth. So social media is so easy to let loose with our more base tendencies and outlashings, because we can be half a world away from one another. These people that we're insulting and that we're criticizing, they have like we may never see them face to face. Like before the introduction of worldwide communication, even before the use of like telephones or, you know, whatever it is, most communication was done face to face. And if you are mean and rude and nasty to somebody, I mean, but most likely you're probably going to get, you know, slapped in the face, like we saw last night at the Oscars. Essentially, you know, this is what happens. But we have this protection. Like, Michael, I could, you know, insult you, tear you down. You could do the same thing to me. And like, what's the worst that we're going to do to each other? Hang up, you know, get off the call, and then just like go rant about it on our own platform. And so it's just, oh man, it's just so, it's a tool that is so easily used as a weapon. Now, we should try to hold people and ourselves accountable, but like you, I mean, it is a dead horse that you beat, and you need to keep beating the horse, even though it's dead, because it needs to be beat. That a lot of the problems will only be solved through the work of Christians in the local church. And that if you work in your local church and you try to address these problems in the right ways and approach them in biblical scriptural ways that God has ordained for us in the church, then most of the situations are going to be resolved. The sad thing is we don't really want to do that, and so we do take to social media and sort of like are essentially doing exactly what Jesus said. Like, we have these logs in our eyes, we have these beams in our eyes that are trying to pull the specks out of everybody else's eyes. And I think that you know, like conversations like these are great and are good and should happen, as long as they don't turn into hate fests and places that we just tear people down. Like, conversation is good, but this like, you know, rotten tomato throwing is never good in any situation. So I'll just respond to that to social media. I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think that is really helpful in as far as breaking down that whole dynamic online. So I was talking to somebody, so though I haven't been on Instagram, For what, almost 3 weeks now. I don't even know, maybe 4. I have been on Twitter, so I just traded one thing for the other. But what I have noticed is that on Twitter, especially, like, though the comments in Instagram in the comment section can get a little rough, Twitter is like just this automatic, like, just back and forth, this just assuming the worst about everyone all the time, no matter what happens. And I think that's a good transition, what you said there, as far as if we're focusing in on our local church and saying, okay, well, these, because I think one of the things that social media is good for is that it at least allows us to see what kind of the thought processes of Christianity throughout sort of the world is, or the United States is, so we can go, oh, okay, well, that's an issue, so I need to at least know how to address that issue if it comes to my local body. But primarily, I think what we don't focus on, like you said a lot, is just our own local, like, worry about yourself, worry about your local church. I mean, the rest of this out here, yeah, it's an issue and you should know about it, but you're not gonna, like, that's not where we're necessarily called to really to do what we do. Like, you are a part, you're supposed to be a member of a local church. You're supposed to be participating in that local body. You're supposed to, whatever gifts you have are supposed to be utilized there. So worry about that. Like, yeah, be aware of everything, but picking some fight online with some random stranger is the weirdest thing. And I've just seen it just exponentially on Twitter, way more than Instagram, where it's just this back and forth. And we'll use that. We have about 15 minutes left tonight. I do want to use that as sort of a transition into this whole MacArthur thing. So how familiar are you with the whole Royce Report MacArthur deal that's happened?
I'm only familiar to the point of what little that you and I have spoken about.
Okay. So I think that's a good example of what you've talked about, though. So, right. So just a brief synopsis, if you guys are watching, I have 3 videos on this because I went down a rabbit hole, like, hardcore, trying to figure out this whole thing. But you can watch those if you want, like, a very in-depth thing. But the 3,000 foot view is basically what you've just explained, what we're talking about. Because what I've seen is, like, people going, oh no, we need to worry about this church and what these people did, and making sure that, we, bring justice here. And in this instance particularly, and the one thing I do want to, I don't know if we don't really have a whole lot of time to dig into it too much, but we're so worried, or there seems to be quite a few people worried about how another church did church discipline, but they don't even know if church discipline's exercised in their own church, or what that would even look like, or how they would even do it. And online, it's really easy to either attack Julia Royce for the report she put out, or attack John MacArthur because you have some bone to pick with him, and Julia is a convenient way to get at him. That we're not really thinking about, like what you said, like, our local body of believers. I was having this conversation with my wife the other day. Since I've been off Instagram, though I have been on Twitter, it's not been like as much time invested. I've been able to put so much more time into lesson prep, to sermon. Like, my mind's not divided in 1,000 different directions, trying to figure out, like, oh, how do I come back to this comment? How do I answer this comment? It's just like, oh, this isn't even a thing that I'm thinking about, and I can actually focus on the people where I'm at. So I guess we don't have a ton of time left, but one of those things that I've seen is that it seems to be that we as Christians, and this sort of kind of ties into what you were talking about, we're so focused on everything else that's going on that we're not devoting the time that we need to our local body, to discipling those people, to bringing up those people, to, living, I know it's a cliche thing, but living life with the people that we're actually in community with. And we're so focused on taking down these other people, or disproving these other people, or having theological fights with these other people, that we're actually neglecting the very thing that we're supposed to be putting our time and energy into, which is our local body. So I think what you said already about, the whole, just how we deal with people is incredibly helpful. What would be?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, is the main issue that people are taking with John MacArthur is that they don't believe that that Grace Church, or Grace Community Church, or whatever it's called, that they supposedly either did not handle church discipline correctly with the husband and wife, or is the primary focus on the fact that the husband, the man in question, was convicted of pedophilic abuse of his children, and that because he consistently pled guilty, and he now has like a Bible ministry in prison, and they are monetarily supporting him in facilitating that. Is it which of those two issues, or is it a little bit of both?
It's a little bit of both. So one of the primary issues is that many people feel like that they treated Eileen, his wife, unfairly in publicly shaming her and doing church discipline the way they did when they did not hold David to that same account. Now, the one thing I would correct you on is that David actually pled not guilty to the sexual abuse charges. He still to this day says he didn't. And so Grace Community Church, the elders, believe him. They think he's wrongly convicted, and therefore they are still supporting him in prison. And that's also why he hasn't been brought under church discipline, as far as I can tell, is because the physical abuse he did repent of in counseling. And so he was never around the kids after that. So he's repented of that. It's not like he re-abused them. And then the sexual abuse that he was convicted and sentenced for actually happened, as the children say, it happened at the same time that the physical abuse was happening. So, but again, the important caveat there is that David has not, he says that never happened, and Grace Community Church elders believe him, and therefore they don't see a reason apparently to obviously put forth church discipline on him. And they did put forth church discipline on Eileen, because she refused to reconcile with David even after he showed repentance for the physical abuse and showed active work in sort of trying to reconcile with her. And that's where the church discipline came in, as far as I can tell from everything that I've read from it. So people don't think she was treated fairly, and they also hold issue with the fact that Grace Community Church thinks that he was wrongly convicted, even though the state did convict him of those things. So it's a sort of a both and in that situation. So it's one, I think the big thing, kind of tying in what we talked about, not that we shouldn't be concerned about discipline being done incorrectly or abuse in other churches, because that is a thing that we need to make sure that doesn't happen. But I think what I've seen, especially over the last couple of weeks, is such an obsession with that, to where it's like that's not your local body. So yeah, you should be aware of it. And yeah, you should be, if you want to dig into it and go down a wormhole and make 3 videos about it, go for it. But ultimately, it's not your local body. So it's not as if those elders have to answer to you, because they're not your elders. And it's one of those things that there's not any biblical backing for them to have to make a statement. That's a very American sort of churchy, entrepreneur, corporate sort of mentality. We don't have any biblical basis for that. They are over their people, and they handle their people the way they see fit. And so it's sort of,
I mean, if you don't like John MacArthur, then just if you don't care for John MacArthur's handling of the situation, just don't listen to him, don't support him, don't go to Grace Community Church. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think one of the things that's very interesting to see sort of how, and we'll sort of, I guess, end with this. It's been interesting to see, and this happens even with the Jackie Hill Perry thing. It happens with a ton of things within Christianity, is that we are so bad, I think, as believers, of having sort of a discerning, even keeled, I want to see all of the information first, and then I will make a decision based upon that information and scriptural backing of that information. But like automatically with the Jackie Hill Perry tweet, with the John MacArthur stuff, like it was just like poof, parting of the waters, like extreme on one side, extreme on the other, condemning or siding with. And it's just like there's no wonder that we have such fracturing within the church, because we pick sides so quickly without saying, okay, well, what was their intent here? What is their history here? I mean, I was as even killed as with those videos as I could be, but even after looking at the information, I go, look, John MacArthur has 50 years of no scandals, no, I mean, it's not like he was involved in any money laundering. He wasn't involved in any of the things that typically bring down ministries. The man has not had that. And the best that has come up apparently is, how much he makes. And then two, this whole thing where there's this question of if he handled it correctly or not. And I think we just don't come. We're not built. We're built as reactionary people now because of how fast we can get information. And we're not built to sit down and say, all right, let's try to take all of our bias out of it as much as we can and just look at the stuff and say, hey, let's see what happens. So I think the internet doesn't help us do that because we're in such echo chambers. It just reinforces that over and over and over again that, oh yeah, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm right, you're wrong. So
yeah, it looks like Callie or Kelly says, accountability, yes. Witch hunt, no. Mm-hmm. Very, very, very true. Thankfully, at least as a culture, we're past the witch hunts, but that's essentially what we're trying to do, these mm-hmm. nationwide, worldwide witch hunts. Yeah. And then as he says, Conversations That Matter podcast and Protestia made good videos on the JMac situation.
Yep. But so with that, and John, people have a huge bone to pick with John Harris and Protestia for whatever reasons that I'm unaware of. But John Harris on that Conversation That Matter podcast did a really long, drawn out, kind of timeline situation that was really well done, I think. But so let's end with this. Let's end on a positive note. So what? Because you are. I know you are humble and you will not, you'll take the compliment but shrug it off at the same time. I think that you're very wise in this regard. What sort of advice would you give somebody, right, that does deal with this, like they're online all the time and they get really worked up constantly about all this stuff? What advice would you give for them to step back and actually invest in their local church a little bit more?
The first piece of advice that I would give in the action or attempt to step back and sort of calm yourself down is to remember that I believe that it's either Peter or in one of the pastorals when it says that when we approach someone to try to correct them with gentleness, it says, and be careful lest you yourself fall into the same thing. So when you're being critical of somebody, remember this. We're all human. There is no temptation that has taken us except that which is common to humanity, that which is common to everybody. So think of it. Imagine if that was you who made a terrible mistake, a terrible decision. Imagine if that was your father or mother, brother, sister, cousin, whoever it may be. Would you be as critical on yourself or on someone that you love as you are on this other person? And that's essentially what Jesus said. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. With whatever measure that you judge others, you will be judged in that same way. And so when we do that, we set ourselves up. So it's always good to look at it from that perspective, to calm down, step away, say, okay, I'm going to try to do better. Secondly, as far as trying to improve your local church, if you are a pastor or an elder or a minister of some sort, I would advise you to read books, maybe on the topic of church discipline, of structure, of some Christian leadership books, to try to become, to use a very sort of like a pep talk phrase, but become the best version of yourself that you can in a position of leadership. And if you are just someone who serves in church in whatever aspect, because everybody has to be a servant in one way or another. There's nobody on the sidelines in the church. Everybody's involved. If you're one of those people, in the same way, follow the advice that Paul gives the Thessalonians. Do your best to live quietly, to mind your own business, and to work with your own hands.
Yep. That right there is a good place to end on. That's great advice. Preached on that just recently. Like, just say this. Just who cares? Hey, you focus on you. What are you doing right now? Yeah. If we all got that, well, we'd probably just we'd either delete social media or be a whole lot kinder to other people when we interact with them online. All right. Well, awesome. Guys, thanks for joining in. Thanks if you're watching this, all that sort of stuff. If you like this, all that, make sure you like it. Put a thumbs up. That helps the algorithm. It feeds the beast, lets other people know that this stuff is here. And then if you do come back next Monday night, every Monday night at 8 o'clock, we're going to be hopping on talking about either the memes that have kind of really taken off online and the conversation started, or Christian content that's just Christian culture stuff that's going on online, kind of like we did last week and what we did this week. But anyway, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you later. See ya.